mean I'll see it.
I never used to believe people when they talked about bad vibes or places having a certain weight to them. To me, an old building was just an old building, cracked plaster, drafty windows, and a lot of history that didn't really matter to anyone living. But my wife, Sarah, she always felt it. When we pulled up to that resort for our anniversary, she didn't even want to get out of the car. It was one of those massive, historic places tucked away in the mountains, the kind of hotel that looks like it's trying to hide behind the pine trees. The architecture was stunning, sure, but there was this oppressive stillness about it. The air didn't move. Even the birds seemed to keep their distance from the roofline. We were celebrating 5 years, and I'd spent a lot of money to get us a suite in the historic wing. I thought it would be romantic. I thought the creaky floorboards and the velvet curtains would be charming. Instead, as soon as we stepped into the lobby, I felt this sudden, sharp pressure in my sinuses, like the atmosphere inside the building was different from the world outside. The wood paneling was deep, bruised red, and the carpets were so thick they seemed to swallow the sound of our footsteps. The suite they gave us was at the very end of a long, narrow corridor. There were no other doors nearby, just a heavy, oak entrance that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. Inside, the room was beautiful in a dying sort of way. There was a faint smell of cedar and something else, something metallic, like a copper penny resting on your tongue. We tried to make the best of it. We had dinner, drank some wine, and eventually crawled into the massive 4-poster bed. Sarah fell asleep almost instantly, but I stayed awake for a while, just listening to the building groan. Old hotels like that, they're never really silent. You hear the pipes whistling and the wood settling, but this was different. It sounded like something was dragging itself through the walls. I eventually drifted off into that heavy, uncomfortable sleep you get when you're in a strange place. I don't know how long I was out, but I woke up suddenly. The room was pitch black, and the air had turned freezing. I could see my breath puffing out in the moonlight. My ears were ringing, and for a second, I thought I was still dreaming. I felt a weight on the edge of the mattress, right by my feet. It wasn't Sarah. She was curled up on her side, breathing deeply. This was a small weight, like a heavy suitcase had been set down. Then I felt a hand. It wasn't a normal hand. It felt damp and incredibly cold, like a piece of raw meat pulled straight from the fridge. It pressed against my ankle, and I froze. My heart was slamming against my ribs so hard I thought it would break. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. And then I felt a face move close to mine. I didn't see it, but I could feel the heat of someone's presence, even though their breath was like ice. A voice, small and wet, whispered right into the shell of my ear. "Wanna come play?" It wasn't a cute, childish voice. It sounded like a kid whose throat was full of fluid. It was raspy, desperate, and sounded like it was coming from a throat that had been crushed. I scrambled for the lamp on the bedside table, knocking over a glass of water in the process. When the light flickered on, the room was empty. The weight on the bed was gone. The door was still deadbolted from the inside. Sarah groaned and blinked at the light, asking me what was wrong, but I couldn't even find the words to tell her. I spent the rest of the night sitting upright, staring at the closet door, watching for the handle to turn. The next morning, I was a wreck. My skin felt tight, and I had this crawling sensation on the back of my neck. As we were checking out, I tried to play it cool. I didn't want to sound like a lunatic. I waited until Sarah went to the car, then I leaned over the marble counter and looked at the desk clerk. She was an older woman, her skin like parchment, and she wouldn't meet my eyes. I told her we had a problem with noisy kids in the hallway. I told her someone had been running around and even managed to get into our room. The clerk stopped typing. She looked up, and I saw her pupils were pinpricks. Her face went a shade of gray that I've only ever seen on a corpse. She told me, very quietly, that we were the only guests in that entire wing of the hotel. The only family with children was staying 3 floors up, and they hadn't left their room all night. Then she leaned in. She whispered that for years, people in that specific suite had reported a child asking to play. But it wasn't just a ghost story. She told me that back in the late 70s, a child had gone missing from that exact room. The parents were wealthy, and the hotel had hushed it up to avoid a scandal. They never found the boy. At least, not officially. I left the hotel as fast as I could, but the feeling stayed. With me. I couldn't stop thinking about that wet, crushed sound in the voice. A few weeks later, I started doing some digging. I found an old archived news report from a local paper that had been shut down years ago. It wasn't just a disappearance. There had been a renovation in the 90s, and a contractor had found something in the crawl space beneath the floorboards of that suite. The report described it in a way that made me want to heave. They found a small, reinforced cavity behind the brickwork of the fireplace. Inside were the remains of a child, but it wasn't a quick death. There were scratches on the inside of the bricks, fingernail marks that had bled into the mortar. The bones were found in a huddled, defensive position, and there were dozens of small, plastic toy soldiers scattered around the ribcage. The most horrific detail, the one that keeps me up at night, was the cause of death. The child hadn't starved. He'd been fed through a small gap in the masonry, but only enough to keep him alive for months while someone played games with him through the wall. I realized then what that voice meant. When that thing asked me if I wanted to play, it wasn't an invitation. It was a warning. It was the only thing that poor kid knew how to say after months of being kept in the dark, treated like a living doll by someone who worked at that resort. I still have dreams about it. I dream that I'm back in that bed, but this time I don't turn on the light. I just feel those damp, cold fingers slowly pulling the covers back, inch by inch. And I can hear the sound of those plastic toy soldiers clicking together on the floorboards as something crawls out from the shadows beneath the bed, waiting for its turn. You think you're safe in those big, fancy hotels. You think the locks on the door matter. But they don't. The locks are there to keep people out. They don't do anything for the things that are already inside the walls, waiting for someone new to join the game. I still have a faint mark on my ankle, a pale, circular bruise that hasn't faded. It's the size of a small thumb. And sometimes, when the house is quiet and the sun goes down, I swear I can hear a faint, wet scratching coming from behind my own bedroom wall.
Next story.
I've spent a lot of time in cheap motels because of my job, so I thought I'd seen the worst of it. I'm used to the smell of industrial-strength bleach trying to cover up decades of cigarette smoke, and the kind of carpets that make you want to keep your shoes on even when you're getting into bed. But this place, a nameless roadside spot tucked behind a cluster of dying pine trees, felt different from the second I pulled into the gravel lot. The layout was a total mess, a confusing maze of narrow hallways that seemed to lead in circles, with doors that didn't follow any logical order. It felt like the building had been expanded a dozen times by someone who didn't have a blueprint, just a sledgehammer and a lot of bad intentions. The air inside was thick and stagnant, like the building wasn't breathing. I was staying in a unit at the very end of a cramped corridor, a place where the flickering fluorescent lights made the yellowed wallpaper look like bruised skin. After a few hours of trying to relax, I realized I'd lost one of my favorite earrings, a small gold stud that had belonged to my grandmother. I remembered taking them off near the bed, and I figured it must have rolled behind the headboard when I set it on the nightstand. That headboard was one of those massive, old-fashioned wooden pieces that was bolted to the wall, or so I thought. When I tugged on it, the whole thing shifted with a heavy, grinding sound. It wasn't bolted at all, it was just sitting there, leaning against the drywall. I had to put my shoulder into it, heaving the weight of the wood back so I could see the floor. That's when I noticed something wrong. The wall behind the bed wasn't a solid surface. There was a faint, jagged outline in the plaster, a rectangular seam that had been sloppily filled in and painted over to match the rest of the room. The paint was old and brittle, and my shifting of the headboard had caused the seal to crack. A few flakes of white plaster fell away, revealing a dark gap. My first thought was that it was just a maintenance access panel, but curiosity got the better of me. I used a pocket knife to pick at the loose bits of plaster, and a larger chunk fell inward, vanishing into a space that felt far too deep to be a crawl space. I leaned in, clicking on the flashlight on my phone, and peered through the opening. It wasn't a closet. It wasn't a maintenance shaft. It was an entire room. The space on the other side was perfectly preserved, like a terrifying time capsule from the mid-70s. The wallpaper was a garish, repeating pattern of burnt orange and olive green, peeling away from the corners in long, wet-looking strips. The air that drifted through the hole hit me like a physical weight. It smelled of extreme age, a suffocating mix of mothballs, sour rot, and something metallic that made the back of my throat itch. I managed to widen the hole enough to squeeze through, my skin crawling as the jagged plaster scraped against my arms. I don't know why I went in. Maybe I thought there was something valuable, or maybe I just couldn't wrap my brain around why someone would wall off a perfectly functional room with everything still inside. When my feet hit the floor on the other side, the sound was muffled by a thick, shed carpet that felt strangely damp under my socks. The room was fully furnished. A small wooden table sat in the center of the floor, and on it was a plastic tray with a half-eaten meal. There was a plate of what looked like it might have once been Salisbury steak and mashed potatoes, but now it was just a landscape of black, furry mold that seemed to pulse in the low light of my phone. A fork was still gripped in a clump of the rot, standing upright. Beside the tray was a glass filled with a dark, syrupy residue that had dried into a crust at the bottom. Everything was coated in a layer of dust so thick it looked like gray velvet. It sat on the television set, the kind with the big wooden cabinet and the manual dials, and on the rotary phone sitting on the nightstand. But it was the bed that made my stomach turn. A large, hard-shell suitcase, one of those old Samsonites, was sitting right in the middle of the mattress. It was open. I walked over to it, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I shouldn't have looked. I should have just crawled back through the hole and checked out of that motel right then. But I leaned over and shone the light into the suitcase. It wasn't clothes inside. It was hair. Great, matted clumps of long, dark hair filled the entire bottom of the case, tangled together with what looked like pieces of jewelry and scraps of fabric. And underneath the hair, I could see the glint of something white. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and brushed aside a few strands. It was bone. Small, delicate bones, fingers, maybe, or pieces of a rib cage that had been meticulously cleaned and arranged like a macabre collection. The realization hit me that the room hadn't been walled up to preserve it. It had been walled up to hide what had happened inside. I turned to leave, but the beam of my light caught the edge of the shed carpet near the bathroom door. There was a stain there, a massive, dark bloom that had turned the orange fibers into a deep, crusty black. It led from the bed all the way to the bathroom, as if something heavy and leaking had been dragged across the floor. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I forced myself to walk toward the bathroom, my boots sticking to the carpet with every step. The bathroom door was cracked open just an inch. When I pushed it, the hinges didn't make a sound. They were well-oiled, which was the most terrifying thing I'd noticed yet. Inside, the bathtub was full. Not with water, but with a thick, gelatinous sludge that looked like decomposed organic matter. It was a soup of gray and red, and poking out of the surface was the top of a human skull, the skin still clinging to the jawline in tattered, translucent ribbons. I felt the bile rise in my throat. This wasn't just an old crime scene. The room was a tomb that had been forgotten by the world, but the smell was too fresh. It wasn't just the scent of the 70s. It was the scent of something that had been decaying for a long time, and something that was still wet. I backed out of the bathroom, my eyes darting around the room, and that's when I saw it. On the nightstand, next to the dusty phone, was a small, gold stud earring. My grandmother's earring. I hadn't dropped it behind my headboard. It was sitting here, in this sealed room, perfectly clean and free of dust. I didn't think. I scrambled back toward the hole in the wall, my breath coming in jagged, panicked gasps. As I reached the gap, I heard a sound from the other side, from the room I was supposed to be staying in. It wasn't a voice. It was the sound of something heavy being moved. The headboard. Someone was pushing the headboard back into place. I lunged for the opening, thrusting my hands through the gap just as the heavy wood began to slide across the hole. I screamed, a raw, guttural sound that didn't even feel like it came from me. I jammed my arm into the narrowing space, but with pinching my skin against the plaster. On the other side, I could see a shadow, a tall, thin shape standing in the flickering light of my original room. It didn't have a face, just a blur of pale skinware. Features should have been. It didn't stop. It kept pushing, the weight of the furniture grinding against my bones. I managed to use my shoulder as a wedge, screaming and kicking against the wall of the hidden room until the headboard hit a snag in the carpet and stopped. I threw my entire weight against it, shoved it back a few inches, and tumbled through the hole, collapsing onto the floor of my room. The space was empty. The door to the hallway was standing wide open, swinging slightly on its hinges. I didn't grab my bags. I didn't grab my shoes. I ran out of that room and down the maze of hallways, my socks sliding on the linoleum until I burst through the front lobby and out into the night. I didn't stop driving until I was 3 towns away. I never went back for my stuff. I told the police, but when they went to investigate, they told me the motel owners claimed that wing of the building was under renovation and completely vacant. They said they found my room, and the headboard was bolted firmly to a solid, unbroken wall. No hole. No hidden room. No suitcase full of hair. But I still have the bruise on my arm from where the wood pinched me. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night in my own apartment, I look at the wall behind my headboard. I think about how easy it would be to build a frame, hang some drywall, and paint it over, leaving a person on the other side to simply cease to exist. I haven't worn earrings since that night. I can still feel the weight of that gold stud, sitting clean and shiny on a dusty table in a room that isn't there.
Next story.
I've always been the kind of person who double-checks the locks and looks under the bed. It isn't even a choice anymore. It's just a ritual I have to perform before I can even think about sleeping. People call it paranoia, but when you spend half your life living out of a suitcase in corporate hotels, you start to realize how easy it is to become a ghost in someone else's building. You're just a name on a reservation, a credit card number, and a body in a bed. Last month, I was staying at this place, one of those high-end, glass and steel towers that's supposed to make you feel safe because everything is so white and sterile. But the higher the price tag, the more I find myself looking for the cracks in the polish. The bathroom was the kind of place that felt too clean. Everything was marble and brushed chrome, but the air felt heavy, like it was recycled through 1,000 pairs of lungs before it got to me. I was brushing my teeth when I noticed the HVAC vent near the ceiling. It wasn't flush against the wall. One corner was drooping just a fraction of an inch, leaving a sliver of darkness behind the metal slats. Most people wouldn't even see it, but like I said, I'm wired differently. I stood on the toilet seat, my socks slipping a bit on the cold lid, and leaned in close to get a better look. I figured it was just a loose screw, something I could fix with a thumb turn so I wouldn't have to think about it. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming the beam straight into the gap. That's when I saw the glint. It wasn't the dull gray of galvanized steel or the white of a spider web. It was a sharp, crystalline reflection, a tiny spark of light that hit my retina and made my stomach do a slow, sickening roll. My first thought was a camera. It's always the first thought. I felt that heat crawl up the back of my neck, the absolute violation of knowing someone might be watching me stand there in my underwear. I reached up and hooked my fingers into the slats, pulling the vent cover. It didn't fight me. It came away with a soft, dry scrape, and a thick layer of gray dust fell into my hair and eyes. It wasn't a camera. It was worse. Behind the vent, someone had built a rig, a crude but effective periscope made of 3 small, rectangular mirrors taped to a wireframe. They were angled perfectly to capture the reflection from the shower and the bed, funneling the image back into the dark void of the wall. I reached in, my fingers trembling, and pulled the mirrors out. They were covered in greasy fingerprints. Not mine, old ones. Smears of skin oil and dust that had been baked on by the building's heat. I looked into the hole where the rig had been, and that's when I realized the vent didn't lead to a duct. It led to a service crawl space, a narrow, black artery that ran between the rooms. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I needed to know how deep the rot went. I grabbed a chair from the desk, pushed it into the bathroom, and climbed up until I could shove my head and shoulders into the opening. The smell hit me immediately. It wasn't just dust. It was the smell of a locker room, sweat, unwashed hair, and something sweet and sickly, like rotting fruit hidden under floorboards. I clicked my light on and swept it across the crawl space. It was a narrow tunnel, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through on their hands and knees. And right there, directly behind my headboard, someone had set up a nest. There was a folding camp chair, the cheap nylon kind, and the floor around it was littered with things that made my blood turn to ice. There were dozens of Polaroid photos scattered in the dust, not of me, but of people who had stayed in this room before. Women sleeping, men stepping out of the shower, couples, some of them were dated from years ago. But it was the table next to the chair that made me want to scream. It was a small plastic crate, and on top of it sat a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters, a roll of duct tape, and a collection of small, jagged trophies. There were locks of hair tied with dental floss. There was a gold wedding band that looked like it had been bent out of shape. And there was a pile of fingernails, cleanly clipped, organized by size into little rows on the plastic surface. Then I saw the stains on the concrete floor. They weren't old. There were dark, brownish red splatters that had soaked into the porous stone, forming a trail that led deeper into the darkness of the maintenance tunnel. It looked like someone had been dragged. I followed the light of my phone further down, and I saw a heavy, steel door at the end of the crawl space. It was slightly ajar. I could see a sliver of the hallway on the other side, a part of the hotel that wasn't meant for guests. I scrambled down from the ceiling so fast I nearly broke my ankle on the toilet rim. I didn't call the front desk. I didn't pack my bags properly. I just shoved my laptop into my bag and grabbed my shoes. I felt like there were eyes on every inch of my skin, peering through the walls, through the mirrors, through the very fabric of the building. I ran out of the room, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. When I got to the elevator, the wait felt like an eternity. Every time the floor indicator beeped, I flinched, expecting the doors to open and reveal whatever lived in the walls. I finally reached the lobby, my breath coming in jagged gasps. The girl at the front desk looked at me with that professional, empty smile, asking if everything was all right with my stay. I couldn't even speak. I just threw the plastic keycard onto the marble counter and turned toward the glass revolving doors. I reached the sidewalk and felt the cold night air hit my face, but the relief didn't come. I stopped for a second to catch my breath, looking back up at the towering hotel. The windows were all dark, reflecting the city lights like 1,000 blind eyes. That's when I saw him. He was standing in the large, floor-to-ceiling window of the third-floor mezzanine, the maintenance level. He was wearing a faded blue uniform with a name tag I couldn't read from that distance. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, his forehead pressed against the glass, watching me. Even from the street, I could see his expression. It wasn't one of anger or fear. He was smiling, a wide, vacant grin that showed too much of his gums. In his hand, he held something small and white. I got into my car and drove. I didn't stop until I was 3 towns over, sitting in a brightly lit gas station parking lot. I reached into my pocket to grab my phone to call the police, but my hand brushed against something sharp. I pulled it out. It was a small Polaroid photo. I must have snagged it from the crawl space without even realizing it in my panic. It was a photo of me. Not from tonight. It was a photo of me from the first night I stayed there 3 days ago. I was fast asleep, my mouth slightly open, my arm hanging off the side of the bed. But in the photo, the vent cover was already off. And there was a hand, a pale, dirt-streaked hand, reaching out from the darkness of the wall, hovering just inches above my throat. The police went back, of course. They told me the crawl space was empty. No chair, no photos, no fingernails. They found the periscope, but they played it off as a voyeuristic prank from a former employee who had probably been gone for months. They told me the stains were just old hydraulic fluid from the elevator shafts. But I know what I saw. I know the difference between oil and the copper smell of drying blood. The worst part isn't the hotel, though. The worst part is that now, whenever I'm in my own house, I can't stop looking at the vents. I'll be sitting in my living room, watching TV, and I'll hear a soft, rhythmic thud from inside the drywall, the sound of something heavy moving slowly through a space that's supposed to be empty. I tell myself it's just the house settling. I tell myself it's the pipes. But then I remember that man's smile, and I wonder how many other buildings have tunnels we don't know about. I wonder how many people are watching us right now, not through a screen, but through a thin sheet of metal and a well-placed mirror. Whatever you do, the next time you check into a room, don't just look for cameras. Stand on the bed. Look at the vents. And if you see a glint of glass, don't wait. Just run. Because by the time you see them, they've already been watching you for a long, long time.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.